We're here with Anatole Kaletsky, who's written a new book, Capitalism 4.0. Here in the aftermath of the crisis, people are looking for what will be the next or the evolutionary process that brings our society back to health. Anatole, thanks for coming and joining us today. Okay. Anatole, you've just written a new book, Capitalism 4.0. I don't know what happened to the other three versions, but we certainly had a crisis. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, what inspired me to write it was the crisis, but what I was writing, the content of the book, was try to explain exactly what happened to the previous three versions. That's why it's called Capital 4.0. My argument is that this crisis that we had from 2007 to 9 was possibly, or will be seen with hindsight, as the fourth great crisis of capitalism, comparable to what happened in the 30s, when, as I argue, the first version of capitalism was transmuted into the second New Deal version of capitalism. Then the next crisis was the 1970s, the Great Inflation, which created the market fundamentalism of Thatcher and Reagan. And now, another 40 years later, we have the next crisis, which my argument is going to create the fourth version of capitalism. Now, why this new version is going to be different from either of the other two, I think, is this. If you think about it, the third version of capitalism, market fundamentalism, was a period when the markets were always right and the government was assumed to be always wrong. The version before that, the New Deal, the Keynesianism, was the opposite. The government was the savior from the market, which was always wrong. In my view, what we've discovered in this last crisis is that rather than the market being right and the government being wrong, or the market being wrong and the government being right, both the market and the government can be catastrophically wrong. And so in this new version of capitalism, we recognize the fallibility of both markets and governments. But rather than being very depressing and paralyzing, I argue that actually this recognition of fallibility is quite empowering, because what it leads to is a concept that both markets and governments are capable of improvement, and we need, if you like, a system of checks and balances in which the market keeps the areas of the government under control and the government keeps the areas of the markets under control. Not easy to achieve, but I think that's really the ambition of the next era of the capitalist system.
And we work together on INET. The question I have for you is, what's going to keep the experts under control? They seem to get out of a line as well.
Yeah, well, that's the problem, that if we're in a world where the market can't be trusted and therefore traditional or economics, or at least as it has become traditional since the 1970s, which assumes rational expectations, efficient markets, that can no longer be trusted. But we mustn't forget the lessons of the public choice theory of the 60s and 70s, which told us that governments also make mistakes, they become corrupt, they're influenced by short-term public opinion. You can't trust the governments either. And what we need to develop is a number of institutional mechanisms which I think will create a system of checks and balances, I say, comparable, if you like, to the checks and balances in a democratic constitution, where again you recognize that democracy is fallible, and therefore you try to create institutions that are capable of recognizing their own mistakes.
When you look at the period of experts, the expert economists, it was often said that we shouldn't really have hardwired laws, we should give discretion to the regulators. Does your notion of fallibility of governments at times imply that trust would be rebuilt better around rules, or do you still believe giving discretion to those academics or policymakers who can learn and adapt on the fly?
I think that the idea of rigid rule-based systems has actually been one of the things that was discredited in the crisis. Now, you could argue that the rules were wrong or there weren't enough rules, but what we really learned in the crisis, I think, is whatever the rules are, eventually the financial system will find a way of gaming around them and undercutting the original intention of the rules. So I think there has to be discretion. But that discretion in turn has to be controlled by, if you like, an evolutionary system of the rules. Well, one of the main arguments that I make in the book, the premise of it is that really the capitalist system itself is a constantly evolving series of institutions. Not only do you have competition and natural selection within the capitalist model between firms, but my argument is that every time you have one of these systemic crises, the capitalist system itself has a near-death experience, but rather than collapsing in the way that socialism collapsed, because capitalism has an inherent flexibility in it, you develop a new set of institutions with new rules, new forms of discretion, which probably function for 10, 15, 20, 40 years, but eventually will also collapse. So I think even if this new version of capitalism works, it's not going to work forever, and there will be another systemic crisis in 30, 40 years' time, a generation. I don't think we can hope to design, for example, a system of financial regulation that will rule out further crises of this kind forever. With luck, we can avoid them for the next 20, 30, 40 years. But I think one of the lessons we need to draw is that at some point there will be a systemic crisis, and then we need to decide whether governments stand behind the financial system or not. My argument is that actually governments should stand behind the financial system. They have to. They have no choice. They had no choice but to bail out Lehman. But in order to do that, they have to find a mechanism for getting the private sector to pay for that implicit insurance and pay for it in advance.
Yeah, it seems that when they bail them out, they are supporting a system that may, as you hear, like the dynamic of moral hazard, become overgrown. So there have to be some kind of penalties or deterrence for the financial system overextending itself. And I think we may have learned that in the most recent episode, though. I'd be curious, how do you see?
Well, I have a slightly different view of that, of the relationship in finance between government and regulation, regulation and markets. What have we learned from this? I think that the breakdown of market fundamentalism, which I think we have now seen, means that there is always going to be, I think, an implicit guarantee behind the financial system, because we now know, in my view, whatever the rules are, that there will be times when there are such systemic crises that governments have to step in to support financial institutions. And I think there is no system of regulation that would confidently and certainly overcome the need for government support. So the way I look at it is that the lesson we should be drawn is that governments will inevitably always be involved in finance, both in regulating finance, but also ultimately in guaranteeing finance against the breach of those regulations. And therefore, not only do you have to set up new systems of regulation, but you have to set up insurance mechanisms, public insurance mechanisms, and the key is to identify who are the long-term beneficiaries of those insurance mechanisms and make them pay in advance. And crucially, I think that's not just the shareholders in banks, it's also the customers of banks and above all the employees of banking institutions. So I think we have to create pre-funding mechanisms that will get funding from banks themselves, but also their employees and their customers.
So we have identified that the spillovers can be so severe to the real economy that we know we will have to bail out the financial institutions. Does that justify any kind of prior or preventive regulation to stop the bubble from forming or stop the frequency with which we go over the cliff?
I think if you recognize that financial crises are inevitable and they're part of the structure of capitalism, then it absolutely justifies much deeper and more restrictive regulation on these financial institutions. And that's in a sense the most obvious lesson of the crisis. I think it also makes you recognize, though, that even with that regulation, there are still likely to be systemic failures, and therefore you have to have a pre-funded insurance mechanism. And the third point, which I think is crucial, is that it also tells you that macroeconomic policy making has to evolve from the market fundamentalist concepts of the 1970s. So, for example, it is not sufficient for central banks merely to have inflation targets. Central banks in the future, I think, are going to have a multiplicity of objectives, including inflation control, control of, or at least some regulation of the rate of growth of and unemployment. But also, crucially, financial stability is going to be recognized as one of the objectives, not just of regulatory policy, but also of monetary policy, and above all, the interaction between them. So, for example, a lot of people argue that Greenspan kept interest rates too low for too long, and that's what caused the crisis. I don't think that's true. I think the low interest rates were needed to generate an adequate economic recovery after the tech bubble burst. But what they needed was to have low interest rates combined with much more intense and detailed regulation of the financial system to ensure that the benefits of that excess liquidity went into the real economy rather than into asset inflation. In a world where you believe that central banks have only one objective and only one instrument, inflation and monetary policy, you couldn't do that. I think in the next phase of capitalism, we're going to recognize that central banks' macroeconomic policy has multiple objectives, needs multiple instruments, one of which will be financial regulation.
What I'm fascinated by at the time you write this book is that you're talking like this, and Richard Posner, who's a professor of law and economics, an absolute paragon of free market wisdom for many, many years, is saying that the financial system is the nerve center of the economy, and it can destabilize the entire economy. And we have to rethink, in light of September 2008, everything. So I guess I would say, if Posner says we have to go to the drawing board, I'm glad you're at the drawing board too.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think what that indicates, I think, Posner's change of position, and he has shown himself to be a remarkably open-minded and free-thinking individual, unlike so many economists, for example, is that, in a sense, I think it does affirm the point that I was making, that this crisis that we've seen over the last few years is not just a crisis in the financial system or in capitalism, it's a crisis of capitalism, and not just of the capitalist system, but of the whole way we think about economics and politics. Now, whether the convergence of view between Posner on the one hand and a Keynesian like myself is something to be cheered or something rather to be depressed about is another matter.
Well, we all know we have to go to the laboratory, and thank you for your contribution.
Thank you.